either A, they haven't taken any classes on Native people, even though they're the first peoples, or if they have taken any classes, the information they got was not really adequate or representative of the community. Right? But not unlike our president, who had his birth certificate questioned by the birther movement and the teabagger movement, many Native people's identities have been questioned because they are not enrolled, because they are mixed race, especially mixed race with African ancestry. We have to, in this age of Obama, reassert that the truth, that race does still matter. As Michael Eric Dyson, a professor of race studies, has said, or African American studies specifically, has said, we shouldn't be striving to be a post-racial society, we should be striving to be a post-racist society. But culture matters even more than race. We are not in this post-racial moment, and the signs with our president being compared to Hitler by our own citizens should be a reminder of this fact. In my research with the Louisiana Creoles, I tried to assert the need of this nation to focus more on culture and less on race. We are what we do. We are who our people and our ancestors were. If we can do this, then we can heal the soul wound that Native American writers Bonnie and Eduardo Duran discuss in their book, Native American Post-Colonial Psychology. The idea of a soul wound, how many of you have heard of the term post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD? So two Native psychologists, Bonnie Duran, who actually works at the University of Washington here, the co-author of this book, they talk about PTSD being passed from one generation to the next, after going through a traumatic experience like removal for Native people or boarding schools, and that eventually that causes a loss of soul, they say, creating a soul wound, that you have no connection to who your people, your culture, your ancestry, your language. This could be applied to African Americans in terms of the Middle Passage and slavery, or Caribbean communities or Latino communities that have went through similar processes. People who went through war, right? And so I talk about in the book Louisiana Creoles in the first chapter, which is titled Who is White? Because I wanted to question, we're always asking, what does it mean to be an authentic or real person of color? What does it mean to be a real Puerto Rican, or a real black person, or a real Native person? But we never ask the question, what does it mean to be white actually? And is there a soul wound in the white community? By questioning who is white, and what it means not just in a racial sense, but a cultural sense, because I identify with my white ancestry, but in a cultural sense, as being French and Spanish, I wasn't talking so much about race, but about culture, right? I was trying to reverse the question that is always asked about what it means to be that real person of color, as if we're all the same. For Creole people, they assert their mixed race identity not to deny any aspect of themselves, but to claim all of their identities. I actually retell this story in the Creole book about my grandmother. I should probably, maybe I'll show you a picture of her in a moment here. We're sitting around the table, and I was a kid. We'd always go to my grandmother's after Mass, and I was the altar boy for 12 years. And we'd go over, and I remember we were sitting around the table, and she was retelling my aunt this story about a man who she worked with, and he asked her what her race was, and she said, well, I'm white. Oh, I think I didn't get there, but yeah, that's my grandparents, my dad's parents. And so she said, I'm white. And so I looked up and around to catch the eyes of my brothers and sisters, but we waited to get home and debrief in private because we knew that they were racially mixed, and yet they chose this other way. And it was interesting when they moved in the 1970s. My grandfather, there's this other story I tell where my grandfather told my grandmother he didn't want those, quote, niggas, referring to my older half-brothers, whose father, their biological father, we have different dads, is African American, sitting next to, quote, his grandchildren. He was referring to my first cousins, who's they're Creole and Puerto Rican, right? And so they look like them, or they look Latino, or white maybe. And so his actions were but this sort of playing out of racial tension, right? The burying of different identities. And I wasn't so much surprised by the fact that they were changing and leaving Louisiana and leaving behind blackness, because people were doing that a lot. I was surprised that they also were trying to leave the culture behind as well. And so I don't know if any of you have ever seen a film. It's called The Imitation of Life. It's a story where basically a Hollywood actress is a single mom, has a young daughter, and she's white, and then she has a housekeeper. And the housekeeper's daughter actually looks white, but the housekeeper is black. And then they grow up, and the daughter is rejecting being black, and her mother. And so, not until her mother dies, right? She has this tormented life throughout the film and so it's not until her mother dies that she actually tries to realize everything her mom had done for her. So my grandparents decided to show this film to my dad, and he was 12 or 13 at the time, and the siblings were all younger than him, before they left Louisiana, and said, we are not French Creole anymore, we are French Canadians. You decide what you want to be after this. And they all actually chose different things, I think. And so this is what I mean by that, that invisibility and that notion that we need to survive. I think our family situation speaks to the complex historical situation and context in this country where white is privileged not only over black, but over mixed race populations. Creoles, like the Taino Indians of Puerto Rico, and the countless other mixed blood native communities throughout Latin America, the United States, and the Caribbean, reflect a complex mixture of African, indigenous, and European roots, where the number of natives is diminished because these groups were they would either become like these new categories, right? And they would no longer exist in the same way. So sometimes I tell people, let me make this simple because that was complicated. I tell people, if you use the same laws or rules in the state of Louisiana, one drop, 1/64th, 1/32nd, which is 3%, your great grandmother is African descent, then everybody that's related to her is African descent, then no matter what they look like. And so what was I gonna say to that? Oh, if we took the whole country of Mexico and dropped it into the state of Louisiana, then everybody would be black if we use those same standards. And so I question what happens though, not so much in terms of the black-white question, because that's been talked about a lot. I tried to look at it in terms of from the native perspective. Why is it that these two things became so central, blackness and whiteness as a dichotomy, and the native identity continued to become erased? And not just for Creoles, but, for other groups in the Americas like Dominicans and Haitians and Puerto Ricans and Colombians. So to survive into the future, I argue in the book Louisiana Creoles, and in the American Indian Culture and Research Journal, I actually recently edited a few years back a special volume where we looked at Hurricane Katrina, and we talked about the invisibility factor there. We didn't hear about the Vietnamese population. We didn't hear about the native communities there. Why did we not hear about the native communities though? Because most of them are mixed blood. And so when anthropologists were going down into these communities to study who, and put people on the census and count them or not count them, if they were mixed, they put them out as white, or they might put them as black or something else, but they sure weren't counting them as Indian because why? They wanted access to the land, the resources. And that continues to be a struggle. Today, American Indians continue to have a lot of different social issues, and I think one of the issues in terms of the invisibility factor is how much people actually know about native populations. And so, where do you think the majority of native people live? Do they live on reservations or in urban cities? Cities? Anybody else? No ideas? Cities. 60 to 70% of native people live in cities now, but a lot of people still think they live on reservations, and so they don't know. I ask my students sometimes in the native studies classes, how many of you see African Americans walking down the street, when you're just walking down the streets in San Francisco? How many of you see, people of European background or Asian, etc.? Then ask them if they know anyone, if they see native people. And they kind of do and don't. It's interesting because when you're talking about a population that has the highest rate of interracial marriage in the country, as American Indians do, there is no one way to look Indian, right? When people expect you to come in with your 2 braids and your feathers, and everybody's got a dream catcher these days. Do you all know what a dream catcher is? Hanging in their window. People want the symbols and the images, but they don't want to know about the people and the issues that they're struggling and dealing with, right? And so these are the kinds of things that we have to continue to challenge and change. Think about the Bering Strait theory as another example. Did anyone learn about the Bering Strait theory? This idea that there was a land bridge, right, that connected the different continents, particularly the Americas, here to Asia, and that Native people actually are immigrants too because they walked across that bridge, the Siberian, right, into the U.S. and the Americas. So really, they're Asian. They're not Native. They weren't here either. Well, Vine Deloria, who's a Sioux scholar, he passed away in the last year or two. He wrote in a book, Red Earth, White Lies, that, on the reservation, we teach that a bridge, just like the Bay Bridge, which is in San Francisco, or your Washington, I guess, the bridge there, I think that's the right name. It goes both ways, doesn't it? Because you got to get in from this way and that way. So maybe those natives walked into that the other way, right? So it's a very interesting thing, but there's been this fascination, there's this dichotomy of how people think about natives, not just in the United States, but globally. So on the one hand, we have people who still think about natives as the noble person, right? The wise sage, because there's been this crisis in religious identity or spirituality, so everybody wants to go and be like an Indian. The Boy Scouts, for example, right, emerged because people were going out and trying to be like natives.